Imagine standing at the edge of a world that believed, truly believed, it had figured out how to live. The year is 1900. The city is Paris, and it is magnificent. Not in the way cities are magnificent today. Steel, glass, speed. This is a different kind of magnificence. The kind built from limestone and iron, from gaslight and ambition, from the particular smell of fresh bread and horse sweat and wet cobblestones at 6 in the morning. Paris in 1900 is the most visited city on the planet. 8 million people have just poured into it for the Exposition Universelle, the World's Fair, the largest in history. They came from every corner of the globe to see what the future looked like. And what they found was this: a city on fire with possibility. The French called this era the Belle Époque, the beautiful era. And for those who lived through it, for those lucky enough to be standing in the right place in that golden, impossible light, it may have been the closest thing to paradise the modern world has ever produced. But paradise, as it always does, had its shadows. This is the story of Paris in 1900. The beauty, the brilliance, the hunger, and the silence beneath the music. Step out onto the Boulevard des Capucines on a Tuesday morning in May 1900. The first thing that hits you is the noise. Paris in this era is not quiet. It is a symphony of iron wheels on cobblestone, of horse hooves, of vendors calling out prices, of church bells from a dozen directions at once. There are no cars, not yet, not many, but the city is anything but still. By 6 in the morning, the boulangers, the bakers, have already been at work for 4 hours. The scent of fresh baguettes and croissants drifts from every corner. For many Parisians, breakfast is nothing more than this: a warm croissant and a small cup of café noir, consumed standing at a zinc bar, elbow to elbow with strangers. The streets are already crowded by 7. At the center of this daily performance is Les Halles, the great iron market hall that Napoleon III had built, where every morning the entire city seemed to negotiate its survival over crates of vegetables, sides of beef, and towers of oysters. The boulevards themselves are a marvel. Just 40 years earlier, much of Paris had been medieval, narrow, dark, impossible to navigate. Then came Baron Haussmann, hired by Napoleon III, with one simple instruction: rebuild the city. What Haussmann did was radical. He tore down entire neighborhoods. He drove wide, straight boulevards through the heart of Paris, not just for beauty, but for air, for light, and, critics whispered, for cannon fire if the workers ever rose again. The result is the Paris we recognize today. Long avenues lined with identical limestone buildings, their grey facades punctuated by wrought iron balconies, their ground floors occupied by shops and cafes that spill onto wide pavements. It is a city designed to be walked. And in 1900, walk it they did. But Paris in 1900 is not one city. It is at least 2. For the wealthy, the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy who inhabited the grand apartments of the 7th and 8th arrondissement, life in the Belle Époque was extraordinary. Their apartments were cathedrals of comfort, high ceilings painted with allegories, walls hung with velvet and oil paintings, drawing rooms where the conversation moved between Proust and politics, between art and money. A wealthy Parisian household might employ 4 to 12 servants, a cook, a lady's maid, a butler, a coachman, a nursemaid, a laundress. The machinery of bourgeois comfort ran on human beings. For everyone else, the workers, the seamstresses, the street vendors, the migrants. Paris was a different story. The working class lived in the outer arrondissements and the high floors of cheaper buildings, where the toilets were shared on each landing, where families of 5 or 6 occupied a single room, where the rent consumed most of what little the week had earned. Many of these workers had come from the provinces, from Brittany, from Auvergne, from the rural south, drawn by the promise of work and the legend of Paris. What they found was real work, yes, but also exhaustion. 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, in factories, laundries, workshops, and the kitchens of the restaurants where the rich dined. A seamstress in a Parisian atelier in 1900 might earn 3 to 4 francs per day. Enough to eat, barely enough to live, never enough to rise. And yet, even in the working-class neighborhoods, there was a particular Parisian defiance, a refusal to let hardship strip away pleasure entirely. You ate simply, but you ate together. You drank cheap wine, but you laughed. You could not afford the opera, but on Sunday afternoons you danced. If there is one institution that defines life in Belle Époque Paris, it is not the museum, not the cathedral, not the theatre. It is the café. In 1900, Paris has more than 30,000 cafés. They are everywhere, on every corner, under every arcade, beside every market. And they are not simply places to drink coffee. They are offices. They are living rooms. They are the headquarters of revolutions, of love affairs, of philosophical arguments that lasted until 3 in the morning. A working man might spend 2 hours in a café nursing a single glass of wine, and no one would ask him to leave. The café was democratic in this way, a space where, for the price of a drink, you could stay as long as your ideas held out. At the Café de Flore and the Deux Magots in Saint-Germain, writers and painters debated art and politics. At the Café du Dôme in Montparnasse, foreign artists, Americans, Russians, Spaniards, shared tables and manifestos. The city was thinking out loud, and the café was where it did it. And then there was Montmartre. Perched on the hill above the city, Montmartre in 1900 was Paris's wild heart. Bohemian, scandalous, irresistible. It was a village that had only recently been absorbed into the city, and it still felt like another world. Here was the Moulin Rouge, opened just 11 years earlier, where the can-can, the high-kicking, petticoat-flashing dance that shocked and delighted in equal measure, had become a symbol of Parisian freedom. Here was the Chat Noir cabaret, where poets performed to audiences drunk on absinthe and enthusiasm. Absinthe, the green, anise-flavored spirit nicknamed La Fée Verte, the green fairy, flowed freely in these establishments. Artists swore it unlocked something in the mind. Critics swore it was destroying French society. In truth, it did a little of both. For 1 franc, you could enter the Moulin Rouge, drink, dance, and forget entirely that tomorrow was Monday. To understand Paris in 1900, you must understand its relationship with beauty, specifically with the performance of beauty. Fashion in the Belle Époque was not a personal choice. It was a social contract. For upper and middle-class women, the ideal silhouette of 1900 was the S-curve, a corset that pushed the chest forward and the hips backward, creating a posture that was simultaneously graceful and punishing. Women wore these corsets from adolescence. They accepted restricted breathing as the price of respectability. The great Parisian fashion houses, Worth, Poiret, Doucet, dressed the queens, the actresses, the socialites of Europe and America. Paris was not simply fashionable. Paris was the origin of fashion. The word itself, haute couture, was French, and the world accepted this without argument. Beneath the glamour, thousands of petites mains, little hands, stitched the gowns by candlelight and gaslight in the city's ateliers. The women who made the dresses of the Belle Époque rarely had the money to attend the events where those dresses were worn. For men, the uniform of respectability was equally rigid. A dark frock coat, a top hat, a carefully trimmed moustache. To be seen without a hat in polite company was to declare yourself, in some inexplicable way, not quite serious. In the summer of 1900, Paris was hosting the most ambitious exhibition in human history. The Exposition Universelle spread across the banks of the Seine and into the Champ de Mars. It featured 58 nations. It drew 51 million visitors over 7 months. And what it displayed, what it celebrated, was the absolute conviction that science and technology were going to solve every problem humanity had ever faced. At the exposition, visitors saw the first moving walkway, a raised platform that carried passengers at walking speed, and stood open-mouthed at what felt like sorcery. They saw the diesel engine, demonstrated for the first time publicly. They saw radium, recently isolated by Marie and Pierre Curie. They saw X-ray machines. They saw the telephone, still a marvel. They saw the first talking films. Paris had had electric streetlights on some of its boulevards since the 1880s. But in 1900, electricity was still magical, associated with the future, with modernity, with the idea that the darkness that had governed human life for all of history was finally, permanently, ending. The metro, the Paris Underground Railway, opened on July 19th, 1900, just in time for the exposition. On its first day, it carried 30,000 passengers. By the end of the year, it was carrying millions. The city, already extraordinary above ground, had begun to expand below it. And the Eiffel Tower, built just 11 years earlier for the 1889 exposition, and still controversial among many Parisians who called it a monstrosity, now stood as the undeniable symbol of what human engineering could achieve. The future felt inevitable, and it felt magnificent. Perhaps no era in modern history produced more art, in more forms, in a single city, in so short a time, as Paris in the Belle Époque. In 1900, Pablo Picasso, 20 years old, recently arrived from Spain, was walking the streets of Montmartre in patched shoes, burning his own drawings to stay warm in winter, and looking at everything with eyes that would change what painting meant forever. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec was producing the posters of the Moulin Rouge, those flat, brilliant, asymmetric images that reinvented graphic design. Claude Monet was painting water lilies. Auguste Rodin was sculpting the thinker. Éric Satie was composing gymnopédies that sounded like nothing that had existed before. At the Opéra Garnier, still one of the most opulent buildings ever constructed, Paris's wealthy came to hear Massenet, Gounod, and a new form of opera that insisted on overwhelming its audience completely. To attend the opera in 1900 was not simply entertainment. It was a statement about who you were and what you believed mattered. The literary world was equally electric. Marcel Proust was beginning to sketch the ideas that would become In Search of Lost Time. Émile Zola had just finished his great novels. The writer Colette was causing scandal and selling books, in roughly equal measure. Paris in 1900 was not producing culture. It was producing the foundations of modern culture, the ideas, the styles, the questions that the rest of the century would spend its time answering. But we cannot leave Paris in 1900 without speaking of its darkness. The Belle Époque was beautiful, but only for some. The tuberculosis rate in Paris's working-class neighborhoods was catastrophic. In some areas, 1 in 4 residents would die of the disease. Poor ventilation, overcrowding, exhaustion, and inadequate food made these parts of the city invisible graveyards. Child labor was common in French industry until well into the Belle Époque. Children as young as 10 worked in factories and workshops. The women who served as dancers, as models, as performers in the venues we now celebrate, many of them lived lives of genuine precarity, dependent on the goodwill of wealthy men who could withdraw it at any moment. And beneath the cosmopolitan surface, Paris was also a city of violent divisions. The Dreyfus affair, the wrongful conviction of Jewish army officer Alfred Dreyfus on charges of treason, had split France almost literally in two. Anti-Semitism, nationalism, and suspicion of the Republic coiled beneath the elegant surface. For all its beauty, Paris in 1900 was not at peace with itself. The Belle Époque's light was real, but it was the light of a world that had not yet fully reckoned with the inequalities that powered it. The Belle Époque lasted roughly from 1880 to 1914. 14 years after our walk through Paris, the guns of August would begin to fire. The great powers of Europe, France, Germany, Britain, Russia, Austria, would stumble into a war so vast and so terrible that the world they had known simply ceased to exist. The young men who danced at the Moulin Rouge in 1900 would die in the trenches at Verdun. The artists who painted in Montmartre's studios would watch their world dissolve. The confident, luminous certainty that progress was inevitable, that the future was simply a better version of the present, would not survive 1914. Which is perhaps why we are still drawn to the Belle Époque, why its images, those golden lights and those elaborate gowns, that confidence, carry such power. Not because it was perfect, it was not, but because it was so entirely, so completely, so defiantly alive. In Paris, in 1900, people ate bread that still smelled of morning. They argued about painting until midnight. They fell in love in cafes and walked home under electric streetlights that still felt miraculous. They believed in science, in beauty, in the city itself, with an intensity we may never fully recover. The Belle Époque ended, but its echo has never quite faded. And here, in the images and the stories and the faint sound of a piano drifting across a cobblestone street at dusk, it still reaches us. Echoes of the past. Thank you for watching Echoes of the Past. If this journey through Belle Époque Paris moved you, leave a comment and tell us which part of history you want to visit next. Subscribe to join us every week as we walk through the corridors of time and ask the oldest question there is: what was it really like?